Nazi experiments at Auschwitz, Dachau, and others, 1939 to 1945. What happened? Nazi doctors performed a wide range of medical atrocities on prisoners, often under the guise of research. Victims included Jews, Roma, disabled people, prisoners of war, and others. Experiments included deliberate infection with diseases, exposure to extreme temperatures, forced sterilizations, tests of chemical agents, high-altitude and pressure experiments, and appalling surgical procedures without anesthesia. Joseph Mengel's twin studies and selections at Auschwitz are among the most infamous. Who suffered? Thousands of prisoners endured torture, mutilation, permanent injury, or death. Many subjects were chosen because they were powerless to refuse. Consequences and legacy. After World War II, the Nuremberg doctors' trial exposed these crimes. The resulting Nuremberg Code, 1947, established voluntary informed consent and basic protections for human subjects. The Nazi experiments are a fundamental reason modern research ethics and human rights law exist. Unit 731, Imperial Japan, 1936 to 1945. What happened? Unit 731 was a covert Japanese military research unit that conducted biological and chemical warfare experiments in occupied China. Prisoners were exposed to plague, anthrax, cholera, and other pathogens. Reports document vivisection, deliberate infection, forced frostbite tests, and live field tests of biological agents. Who suffered? The estimated victims are in the thousands, primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, but also some Allied POWs. Victims were subjected to lethal experiments and left without treatment. Consequences and legacy. After the war, many Unit 731 personnel avoided prosecution, reportedly because Allied authorities sought the data and the researchers' cooperation. The lack of accountability remains a painful ethical and historical scandal. Tuskegee Syphilis Study, United States, 1932 to 1972. What happened? For 4 decades, the U.S. Public Health Service followed about 600 poor black men in Alabama, promising treatment for bad blood. The men were not told they had syphilis and were denied effective treatment even after penicillin became standard in the 1940s. Researchers tracked the natural course of untreated disease to study its effects. Who suffered? Hundreds of men suffered preventable progression of syphilis, and many died. The disease was passed to spouses and children. Families suffered lasting health and social consequences. Consequences and legacy. Public outrage when the study became public in 1972 led to major reforms in U.S. research ethics, including the National Research Act of 1974 and the creation of institutional review boards and informed consent requirements. The U.S. government formally apologized to survivors and families in 1997. Guatemala Syphilis Experiments, United States, 1946 to 1948. What happened? U.S. researchers deliberately infected Guatemalan prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients with syphilis and other sexually transmitted infections without consent to study treatment and transmission. Who suffered? Vulnerable populations suffered deliberate infection and inadequate treatment. Consequences and legacy. The experiments were largely secret until documented decades later. In 2010, the U.S. government apologized, launched investigations, and provided compensation to survivors and families. The case reinforced the global importance of consent and protections for vulnerable populations. Human radiation experiments, United States, 1940s-1970s. What happened? During and after World War II, U.S. government programs exposed people to ionizing radiation to study health effects. Examples include deliberate injection of plutonium into unwitting hospital patients, irradiating prisoners, and exposing military personnel. In many cases, subjects were not told the true nature or risks of the exposure. Who suffered? Hospital patients, prisoners, soldiers, and pregnant women were among those exposed. Some developed cancers, organ damage, or other radiation-related illnesses. Consequences and legacy. Public exposure in the 1990s led to official investigations, policy changes, and apologies. These programs prompted stricter oversight of human subjects' research and transparency about risks. Willowbrook State School Hepatitis Studies, United States, 1956-1970s. What happened? Researchers studying hepatitis deliberately infected mentally disabled children at Willowbrook State School on Staten Island to study the disease's progression and test vaccines. Parents were sometimes told that infection was inevitable if their child stayed at the institution. Who suffered? Institutionalized children, often unable to consent or fully understand, were intentionally infected and studied. Consequences and legacy. Public outrage and lawsuits contributed to deinstitutionalization movements and helped strengthen protections for people with disabilities in research settings. CIA MKUltra and mind control experiments, 1950s-1960s. What happened? Under MKUltra, the CIA funded experiments into interrogation and mind control that included administering LSD and other psychoactive substances to unwitting civilians, prisoners, and military personnel. Experiments sometimes involved sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and other coercive techniques. Who suffered? Many subjects experienced severe psychological trauma, long-term mental health problems, or were manipulated without knowledge or consent. Consequences and legacy. Investigations in the 1970s, Church Committee revealed abuses. MKUltra became a cautionary example of how secrecy, national security rationales, and poor oversight can enable abuse. Records were partially destroyed, complicating redress. Milgram and Stanford, controversial psychology experiments, 1960s-1970s. What happened? Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the early 1960s placed subjects in a role where they believed they were administering painful electric shocks to others at an authority's instruction. The Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971, led by Philip Zimbardo, simulated prisoners and guards. Participants quickly exhibited abusive behavior and severe stress. Who suffered? Subjects experienced intense stress, emotional harm, and in some cases, lasting psychological effects. Both studies used deception and inadequate safeguards by today's standards. Consequences and legacy. These experiments dramatically reshaped ethical rules in psychology. Institutional review boards, stricter consent and debriefing rules, and limits on deception and psychological harm became standard. The Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. This infamous study at Stanford University showed just how quickly ordinary people can descend into cruelty when given unchecked power. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo recruited college students and randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison. What was meant to last 2 weeks spiraled out of control in less than 6 days. Guards quickly turned sadistic, verbally and physically humiliating the prisoners, while the prisoners became submissive, traumatized, and emotionally broken. Zimbardo had to shut the experiment down early because it was causing real psychological damage. The Stanford Prison Experiment proved that human nature is disturbingly easy to corrupt, raising ethical debates that continue to this day. Final thoughts and resources. Studying these crimes matters for 2 reasons. First, remembering victims honors their suffering and helps prevent erasure. Second, understanding how and why institutions failed teaches us to strengthen safeguards, informed consent, independent oversight, transparency, and accountability. Science without ethics is not progress. If you want reliable further reading, look for books and official reports on the Nuremberg doctors' trial, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Rockefeller Commission, and Church Committee reports on CIA abuses, in scholarly histories of Unit 731. Museums, university archives, and government reports also document these events. Would you like a version focused on primary sources and citations you could use for research or video narration? I can prepare a sourced reading list and timelines next.